The rules method is an alternative means of testing a categorical syllogism for validity. And if a categorical syllogism has been shown to be valid using a correct Venn diagram, then it will also be shown to be valid using the rules method correctly, and same for invalid arguments. Now, before we get to the rules method, we have to look at a new concept, the concept of distribution. And a term is distributed in a claim when it says something about every member of the class that term names. Every term is either distributed or it's not. It's one or the other. More formally, a term is distributed in a claim if, and only if, on the assumption that the claim is true, the class named by the term can be replaced with any subset of that class without producing a false claim. Even more informally, the idea is that in a claim, a term is distributed if that claim says something about every member of that class, everything in that group. Now, in terms of telling whether a claim is distributed or not, there's three methods. One is to memorize this handy table here of claim distribution, and the thing in the parentheses, the term in the parentheses is distributed. A second option is to go by the meaning of the claim, and the meaning, looking at it, how it functions, will tell you whether a term is distributed or not. And the third option, of course, is guessing. It's either is or is not, so guessing has a chance of success. Not a very good one, but, not the worst option. Well, actually, it is the worst option. So here's how the terms are distributed. In an A claim, all S or P sort of claim, the subject term is distributed because it's saying something about all of the S's, namely that they are P. So if all cats are mammals, in a statement like that, the subject cats is distributed because it says of all the cats, they're mammals. Now, the reason why the predicate term is not distributed is because it's not saying something about all of them. So if I say all cats are mammals, this does not tell us about all mammals. With an E claim, a no S or P claim, both subject and predicate are distributed, because if I say no cats are lizards, then I'm saying something about all the cats, namely all the cats are not lizards, and I'm saying something about all the lizards, namely that all the lizards are not cats. So both terms are distributed. With an I claim, some S or P, nothing is distributed, because if I say, for example, that some politicians are Democrats, I'm not saying something about all politicians, I'm not saying something about all Democrats. So in an I claim, nothing is distributed. In an O claim, some S or not P, the predicate term is distributed. That may seem somewhat unusual, but it actually makes sense. If I say that some politicians are not Democrats, then I'm not saying something about all politicians, but I am saying something about all the Democrats in kind of an odd way, but a correct way, namely that all those Democrats are not that S or those S's. So that is the distribution, pattern. And again, the three options are: one, memorize the table; two, kind of go by the meaning of each claim to see what is being distributed; and the third option, of course, is guessing. So now to the rules. There are three rules in the rules method, and in order for an argument to be valid, each of the rules must be successfully passed. Breaking any one of the rules makes an argument invalid. So it has to follow all three to be valid, and if it breaks any number of them, 1, 2, or 3, invalid. All it takes is 1. The first rule is this: the number of negative claims in the premises must be the same as the number of negative claims in the conclusion. Now, since arguments only have one conclusion, in practical terms, this means that if you have a negative premise, then you must have a negative conclusion, or the argument is going to be invalid. It may not be valid, but if it's got one negative premise and one negative conclusion, then it can be valid. But if it has a negative premise but no negative conclusion, invalid. And of course, if it has two negative premises, automatically invalid because there's only one conclusion. So the only thing that could be valid would be one negative premise, one negative conclusion. The second rule is the distribution rule. At least one premise must distribute the middle term. And the way we tell whether it's distributed or not is we go back to our table of distribution, and the middle term, the M term, must be in one of those distribution points at least once. And if it's not, then it's automatically invalid. It can be in more than distributed, more than once, but it must be distributed at least once. So zero distribution on the middle term, then invalid. Lastly, any term that is distributed in the conclusion, so the subject or predicate of the conclusion is distributed, then it must be distributed in its premise. And if this condition is not met, then the argument is invalid. Now, for some examples. So the first example is this. Premise 1, no dogs up for adoption at the animal shelter are pedigreed dogs. Premise 2, some pedigreed dogs are expensive dogs. And conclusion, some pedigreed dogs up for adoption at the animal shelter are expensive dogs. And this breaks rule number 1 because it has one negative premise, the first one, the no claim, but it has zero negative conclusion. So it ends up being invalid by the first rule. So breaking rule number 1, that's all it takes. So invalid. And if it breaks, multiple rules, it doesn't get more invalid. Once it breaks one rule, invalid. Second rule is at least one premise must distribute the middle term, and this example breaks rule number 2. So first, all pianists are keyboard players. Premise 2, some keyboard players are percussionists. Conclusion, some pianists are not percussionists. And rule number 2 is at least one premise must distribute the middle term. And the middle term in this case, the way we find that is we look at the conclusion to see what our S and P terms are. In this case, pianist is S, percussionist is P, and our middle term is a term that doesn't occur in the conclusion, but occurs in both premises. In this case, it would be keyboard players. And so we check for distribution. In the first premise, all pianists are keyboard players. Pianist is distributed because of its location, and keyboard players is not distributed. In the second premise, some keyboard players are percussionists. Well, in a some are claim, nothing is distributed, and so it breaks rule number 2. The premise 1 and 2 do not distribute the middle term, so invalid. And then lastly, rule number 3. Any term that is distributed at the conclusion must be distributed in its premise. So in the conclusion, we have no creditors or large landowners, and creditors, the S term is distributed, and large landowners, the P term is also distributed, because in a no claim, both terms are distributed. So it has to be distributed in its premise. So all mercantilists are creditors. That does not distribute creditors because in an all claim, only the subject is distributed, not the predicate. And in the first premise, no mercantilists or large landowners, that doesn't break the rule because both are distributed. But all it takes is one. So the term creditors is distributed in the conclusion, but the premise number 2 doesn't distribute it. So it breaks the rules. So with the rules method, it's just an additional way to test a categorical syllogism for validity, and it works using rules the same way that Venn diagrams do using visual inspections. And again, it's a way of testing arguments for validity, so if an argument is valid, it will pass both the Venn test and the rule test, and if it's invalid, it will fail both. So that takes us to the end of the rules method for testing categorical syllogisms for validity.